This town, O'Cavan, it's the kind of place where nothing much happens. Quiet. Too quiet sometimes. The kind of quiet that makes your own thoughts echo in your head louder than you'd like. That's why Jake Collins, started writing for the O'Cavan Gazette. The pay was peanuts, but it kept my hands busy. And in a town like ours, stories weren't that hard to find if you looked close enough. But the real story, the one that shook me to my core, that didn't come looking for me. It found me when Ethan vanished. Ethan Hayes, 24, worked the grill at Millie's Diner, the one on the corner of Alder and Main. Always tinkering with his beat-up old Jeep, a '98 Cherokee, in his driveway. Ethan wasn't the type to just up and disappear. He was a creature of habit, you know. Same routine, day in, day out. But one freezing January morning, he finished his shift and never made it home. At first, nobody really freaked. People go missing here sometimes. The woods around O'Cavan, they're vast. And the cold, man, it doesn't care about your plans. Locals call it winter's tax. The first few hours were filled with the usual guesses. Maybe Ethan's Jeep broke down. Maybe he went for a hike and lost track of time. But then, they found his Jeep, parked all neat and tidy in the lot outside the Thornridge trailhead. No snow on it. No signs of a struggle, no note, nothing. Just an empty car sitting there at the edge of the woods, like someone had just dropped it there on purpose. That's when the whispers started. Now, I'm not one for gossip, but a few things didn't sit right with me. Ethan wasn't a hiker, and Thornridge, that trail was closed this time of year. Not somewhere you just stumble upon. You had to be going there on purpose. Then, Ms. Amelia disappeared. Amelia Hayes, no relation to Ethan. She was practically an institution in O'Cavan, taught at the elementary school for 30 years, knew every kid and parent by name. She wouldn't just wander off places, let alone vanish. But one Monday, she wasn't at school. By noon, the cops had her car, a little blue hatchback, towed from the same Thornridge lot. 2 people gone in 2 weeks. That's when I started digging. My neighbor, Sarah, was the first to notice I was onto something. I guess it was the way I was always scribbling in my notebook at the diner, or the way I asked questions, like I was interrogating folks. Sarah's been my best friend since I moved here 5 years ago. Only person who really checks up on me when the weather and the isolation get to be too much. "What are you up to, Sherlock?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from me at Millie's. "Nothing," I lied, closing my notebook real quick. Sarah raised an eyebrow, leaned in, and lowered her voice. "Does this have anything to do with Ethan and Ms. Amelia?" I shrugged, which wasn't much of an answer. "You've got that look," she said. "That I'm about to do something stupid look." "It's just weird, isn't it?" I said. 2 people don't just vanish into thin air, "They do here," she said. "It's the forest. You know how dangerous it is. What's there to investigate?" I wanted to explain, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Instead, I pulled out the pages I'd been scribbling on all morning. A list of everything I knew about Ethan and Ms. Amelia. Their routines, their last known whereabouts, the people who might have seen them last. One name kept popping up. Old Man Hemlock. He ran the hardware store on Willow Street, a cramped, dusty place that looked like it was stuck in the last century. Hemlock himself was just as weathered, thin, wiry, always wearing the same ratty flannel jacket. He had a reputation for being a bit off. The kind of guy who'd say things like, "The forest has eyes," and actually mean it. I stopped by the store later that afternoon. A little bell jingled above the door as I stepped inside. The place smelled like sawdust and kerosene. "You're not here for nails," Hemlock said, without looking up from the counter. I'm looking into the disappearances, I said. Ethan and Ms. Amelia. Thought you might know something. Hemlock's hands froze. He glanced up at me, his eyes dark and sharp. What makes you think I know anything? I held up my notebook. Your name came up. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he sighed, setting down the wrench he was holding. You're better off leaving it alone, son. Why? Do you know what's happening? I know enough, he said. But talking won't change anything. Whatever's out there. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window. It doesn't like being looked at. What do you mean, out there? I pressed. He shook his head. Some things are better left unsaid. Before I could ask anything else, the bell above the door jingled, and he waved me off. That's all I've got. Take care of yourself. As I stepped back out into the biting cold, Hemlock's words stuck with me. Whatever's out there doesn't like being looked at. But it was too late to stop looking. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to Hemlock, to the way his eyes had darkened when I mentioned the disappearances. I decided to take a walk, clear my head. I bundled up and headed toward the edge of town, where the forest loomed. The streets were empty. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the snow and the wind howling in the distance. The forest felt alive, even from a distance. I stopped at the trailhead, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. That's when I saw them. The tracks. They were faint, barely visible in the frost, but they didn't look right. Too wide to be human, too deliberate to be an animal. They led into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the stillness. It was Sarah. Where are you? She asked, her voice sharp. Just walking, I said, clearing my head. You're at Thornridge? Aren't you? I hesitated. How did you? Don't go in there, she said, cutting me off. Just come home, please. The fear in her voice was enough to pull me back. But as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. The morning after my little trip to Thornridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a heaviness in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath. I sat at my desk, staring at the half-written article on my laptop, the blinking cursor mocking me. I'd promised myself I'd stick to writing fluff pieces for the Gazette. You know, local events, community updates, not wild theories about missing people and weird tracks in the snow. But my mind wouldn't let it go. I texted Sarah first thing. You were right. Shouldn't have gone near Thornridge. Her reply came instantly. You okay? Yeah. Just can't stop thinking about it. That's the problem. Let it go. Letting it go wasn't an option. Not when the scene at the trailhead didn't make sense. Not when the disappearances didn't line up with the usual accidents and bad weather. Something was wrong, and I had a feeling Thornridge wasn't just a random coincidence. I spent the day piecing together what little I knew about Ethan and Ms. Amelia. Ethan's Jeep, parked so neatly, like he'd planned to go into the woods. Ms. Amelia's car, found in the exact same spot. Thornridge Trailhead wasn't a popular spot, especially in the dead of winter. The trail was steep, poorly marked, and more than one person had gotten lost there over the years. But 2 people in 2 weeks, that was different. I started asking around, visiting a few locals who knew Ethan and Ms. Amelia. Most people didn't have much to say, just the usual small town stuff. It's a tragedy, and the forest is dangerous this time of year, that kind of thing. But one detail caught my attention. Ethan had stopped by Hemlock's hardware store the day he disappeared. And not just for supplies. He'd spent almost an hour there, talking to Old Man Hemlock. It wasn't the kind of place Ethan usually hung out, especially not for that long. The hardware store was even emptier than usual when I stepped inside. The smell of sawdust and motor oil hung in the air. Hemlock was at the counter, scribbling something in a notebook. He didn't look up when the bell jingled. "Back so soon," he said, without lifting his pen. "Got more questions," I said, stepping closer. "About Ethan." Hemlock sighed and set his pen down, finally meeting my eyes. "I told you last time, son. Leave it alone." "I can't do that," I said. "I know Ethan came here the day he went missing. What were you two talking about?" His gaze darkened, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Ethan wanted to know about the forest. Asked if I'd ever seen anything strange out there." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," Hemlock said, his voice low. "That it's not the kind of place you go looking for answers."
"Why not?"
"Because the forest doesn't like being looked at." His words echoed what he'd told me the day before. But this time there was something different in his tone, a weight that made my skin prickle. "What does that mean?" I pressed. "Are you saying something's out there?" He didn't respond, just stared past me, like he was seeing something I couldn't. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he muttered, "It's older than the trees. Older than this town." "What is it?" I asked. But he shook his head and turned back to his notebook, effectively ending the conversation. That night, the unease settled in deeper. I couldn't shake Hemlock's words, or the way he'd looked past me, as if the forest was staring back at him through the walls of the store. I stayed up late, scrolling through old articles and archives, searching for anything unusual connected to Thornridge or the surrounding woods. There were the typical missing persons reports, stories of hunters who never returned, hikers who underestimated the terrain, but nothing that explained the strange tracks or the connection to Hemlock. Around midnight, the first sound came. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a low hum, rising and falling in the distance. But as I sat there in the darkened room, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was too rhythmic, almost like a chant. It sent a shiver down my spine. I turned off my laptop, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, pulsing through the walls like a heartbeat. I stood frozen, every nerve on edge, until it stopped, as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that makes your ears ring. I reached for my phone, half expecting Sarah to have texted me, but there was nothing. No messages, no missed calls, just the empty glow of the screen. I set it down and forced myself to breathe, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I went back to Thornridge. I told myself it was just to clear my head, to prove to myself that the tracks I'd seen weren't as strange as I remembered. But as I reached the edge of the forest, my heart sank. The tracks were still there, wide, deliberate impressions in the frost, too regular to be natural. They led into the woods, the trees swallowing the trail after a few yards. And hanging from a low branch, near the edge of the trail, was something that hadn't been there before. A watch, an old silver wristwatch, its face cracked and frosted over, despite the lack of fresh snow. My stomach turned as I reached for it, the cold metal stinging my fingers. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Ms. Amelia. She wore it every day, a gift from her late husband. How did it get here? I glanced around, half expecting someone to step out of the woods. But the forest was silent, the trees standing like sentinels against the cold. The humming from the night before echoed in my mind. I shoved the watch into my pocket, and practically ran back to my car. When I showed the watch to Sarah, her face went pale. "That's hers," she said quietly, running her fingers over the cracked face. "But how?" "I don't know," I said. "It was just hanging there, like someone wanted me to find it." She shook her head, her expression a mix of fear and frustration. "This is too much. You need to tell someone." "Tell someone like who?" "The cops," I scoffed. "What am I supposed to say? Hey, I found this watch in the woods, and there's a weird hum at night. They'll think I'm losing it." "But you're not," Sarah said firmly. "But you can't keep this to yourself." Her words lingered as I sat alone that night, the watch sitting on the table in front of me. I thought about calling Deputy Hayes, telling him what I'd found. But what could I say that didn't sound insane? And more importantly, would he believe me? The hum returned just after midnight. This time, it was louder, pulsing through the walls like it was coming from inside the house. My chest tightened, and I grabbed the watch, clutching it like a lifeline. The sound was closer now, more distinct, like voices layered over one another, in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't ignore this anymore. Whatever was happening, it wasn't natural, and I wasn't going to stop until I found the truth, no matter where it led me. The forest was never inviting, not even on a clear day. The dense trees seemed to suck the light right out of the sky, leaving an ever-present gloom that lingered like a threat. But now, knowing what I knew, or rather, knowing what I didn't know, it felt even worse. I stared at the tree line from my car, trying to summon the courage to step out. Sarah had insisted on coming with me. "This is a terrible idea," she said, slamming the passenger door. Her breath fogged in the icy air, and her eyes darted nervously toward the forest. "But I'm not letting you go in there alone. I just need to see where the tracks lead," I said. "It might give us some answers." "You think it's safe," Sarah scoffed. "People have disappeared, and you think a stroll into the woods is a good plan." "I don't think it's safe," I admitted, "but it's the only lead we have." She sighed, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "Fine. But if I see so much as a squirrel acting weird, we're turning around." I nodded, and we started toward the trailhead. The snow crunched beneath our boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Every step felt deliberate, as if the forest were waiting for us to enter. The tracks were still there, the frost-lined impressions leading into the dense woods like a breadcrumb trail. The deeper we went, the more suffocating the air became. The faint hum I'd heard at night seemed to linger here, just at the edge of hearing. Sarah walked close beside me, her shoulders hunched against the cold. The trees around us bore marks, long, jagged scratches that looked too high to be from any animal. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a low branch. It was snapped clean in half, the edges splintered, like something heavy had forced its way through. "Doesn't feel like wildlife," I murmured, taking a closer look. "It's deliberate. What kind of animal makes deliberate moves like this?" I didn't have an answer, and the silence between us felt heavier with every passing moment. We found the campsite an hour in. The remains of it, anyway. A tent lay shredded, its fabric flapping weakly in the breeze. A metal canteen rested nearby, partially buried in the snow. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just emptiness. "This isn't normal," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Even if an animal got them, there'd be tracks." I crouched near the tent, brushing aside some of the snow. The ground beneath was dry, as if nothing had touched it in weeks. Inside, I spotted a flashlight, its lens cracked. It flickered faintly when I picked it up, the dying battery emitting a weak, staccato rhythm. Sarah stood a few feet away, her gaze locked on something farther ahead. What is that? I turned to follow her line of sight. At first, I didn't see it, just trees and shadows. But then, as the light shifted, I saw it. An unnatural shape jutting out of the ground. It was a structure, partially buried and covered in frost. Stone, ancient and cracked, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The patterns didn't resemble any language I'd ever seen. The air around it felt different, heavier, colder. As we approached, Sarah hesitated. I don't think we should get any closer. You don't feel that? I asked, stepping closer despite her warning. It's like it's vibrating. That's exactly why we shouldn't, she shivered. This thing, whatever it is, it doesn't belong here. I ignored her and knelt by the base of the structure. The carvings were intricate, the lines sharp despite their apparent age. I traced one with my gloved hand, feeling an odd warmth radiating from the stone. It didn't make sense. Don't touch it, Sarah said sharply, pulling me back. We don't know what this thing is. No, she interrupted. Listen to me. Something is wrong here. You can feel it. We need to leave. Her voice trembled, and for the first time, I noticed how pale she'd become. She was right. This wasn't the kind of thing you lingered near. I snapped a few quick photos with my phone and stood, brushing snow off my knees. Okay, I said. Let's go. The journey back was worse. The light was fading fast, and the forest seemed to close in on every sound felt amplified. The crunch of snow, the rustle of branches, even our own breathing. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought it was Sarah, but when I glanced at her, her wide eyes told me she was hearing it too. Do you hear that? I asked. She nodded, clutching her coat tighter. Let's just keep moving. The whispers didn't have a direction. They came from everywhere and nowhere, slipping through the trees like a breeze. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear, accusatory, angry. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw the car, a wave of relief washed over me. I turned back one last time, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the structure, the symbols, the unnatural warmth. It all felt wrong. I uploaded the photos to my laptop, enlarging them to get a closer look. The carvings were even more intricate than I'd realized, each one forming part of a larger pattern. I searched online for hours, trying to find any reference to similar symbols. The closest I came was a vague mention of an ancient culture that once inhabited the region. Most of the details were speculative, but one word kept appearing in the articles: eco. Eco. I muttered under my breath, grabbing my phone to text Sarah. Before I could hit send, my screen froze. The photo of the structure filled the display, but something was wrong. There was a figure in the background. It was faint, almost a shadow, but unmistakable, humanoid, tall, and watching. My breath caught as I enlarged the photo. The figure didn't have a face, just an empty void where its features should have been. Sarah came over immediately when I called her, her expression a mix of fear and concern. I showed her the photo, and she stared at it in silence for a long time. This thing, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not just in the forest, is it? I shook my head. I think it's connected to everything. The disappearances, the tracks, the whispers, it's all tied to that structure. She ran a hand through her hair, her fingers trembling. We need to show this to someone. The police, maybe? They won't believe us, I said. Not without more proof. Then what do we do? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. and the forest wasn't going to let us go that easily. Sarah didn't say anything when I suggested we go to Deputy Hayes. She just nodded, her face pale and drawn, clutching her coat like it was the only thing holding her together. We drove in silence to the station, the town eerily quiet as the late afternoon light began to fade. Even the usual winter sounds, the crunch of tires on icy roads, the distant howl of wind, seemed muted. It was like the town was holding its breath. Deputy Noah Hayes met us at the front desk. He was Ethan's older cousin, a guy who always seemed tired, but in a way that made you trust him more, not less. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held a wariness that went beyond just being overworked. "What's this about?" he asked, motioning us into his office. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain without sounding completely unhinged, but Sarah didn't flinch. She pulled the photo up on her phone, sliding it across the desk. "This?" she said simply. Noah glanced at it, his brow furrowing. "What am I looking at?" "The structure," I said. "We found it in the woods, near where Ethan and Ms. Amelia's cars were found. Look closely at the background." Noah leaned in, his eyes narrowing. He didn't say anything for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the faint, humanoid figure. "You're saying you saw this thing?" he asked finally, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. "We didn't see it while we were there," Sarah said quickly. "It only showed up in the photo, but it's connected, I know it is." "And the structure?" he asked, setting the phone down. "What exactly is it?" "We don't know," I admitted, "but it's old, and there's something off about it. The carvings, the way it feels when you're near it. It's not natural." Noah rubbed his temples, letting out a heavy sigh. "Look, I don't know what you two think you found, but this sounds like you're chasing shadows. People go missing in these woods. It's tragic, but it happens. Animals, the elements. There's always a reason." For a long moment, none of us said anything. Then, from somewhere outside, came that hum again. Faint, but definitely there. A low, pulsing vibration that seemed to sink into your bones. We all felt it. Then all of a sudden the hum stopped abruptly. Noah looked up sharply, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's not just the forest. It's that thing, the structure. Whatever it is, it's drawing them here." Noah didn't respond. He stared at the forest, his jaw clenched, his hand still gripping his gun. "We have to destroy it," Sarah said suddenly. Both Noah and I turned to look at her. "That's insane," Noah said. "You don't even know what it is." "We don't need to," she shot back. "It's connected to everything. The disappearances, the shadows, the hum. If we don't stop it, more people are going to disappear." Noah hesitated, his gaze shifting between Sarah and the forest. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "Fine. But we need a plan. And we're not going back in there without backup." We drove straight to Hemlock's store. The old man was waiting for us, as if he knew we were coming. He didn't look surprised when Noah explained what we'd seen, or when Sarah demanded to know how to destroy the structure. "You can't destroy it," Hemlock said simply. "It's not just a thing, it's a doorway." "A doorway to where?" I asked. He ignored my question. "And destroying the doorway doesn't close what's already open." "What does that mean?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "It means you're not fighting the forest," Hemlock said. "You're fighting what's been let through. And if you want to stop it, you'll need more than fire and bullets." "What then?" Sarah demanded. "What do we need?" Hemlock hesitated, his gaze heavy. "The bindings," he said finally. "The symbols. They're what's keeping it contained. If you can rebind it, you might be able to close the doorway. But it won't be easy." He added, "And if we fail?" I asked. Hemlock didn't answer. He didn't have to. We gathered supplies from the store, kerosene flares, anything we could use to hold back the shadows. Hemlock gave us a crude map of the symbols, showing us how to repair the bindings. And then, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we headed back into the forest. The hum was waiting for us. The hum started as a faint vibration, just strong enough to feel in my chest, and grew louder the deeper we went. It was like the forest itself was alive, its pulse sensing with the rhythm of our steps. Even with Noah leading the way, his flashlight sweeping the trees, the oppressive weight of the air made every breath feel labored. Sarah stayed close to me, clutching a bundle of flares tightly. Her determination from earlier had given way to a quiet tension, her eyes darting between the shadows like she expected something to leap out at any moment. I wasn't far behind her, every nerve in my body on edge, the primal part of my brain screaming at me to turn back, to run. But there was no turning back. Noah stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "We're close," he said, his voice low. He pointed to the ground, where faint impressions of the claw, like tracks crisscrossed the snow. The structure was just ahead, barely visible through the trees, its dull glow casting eerie patterns on the surrounding trunks. The carvings shimmered as if alive. "Stick together," Noah warned, unholstering his weapon. He didn't say what we were all thinking, that the shadows could return at any moment. As we approached the structure, the hum became deafening, a steady roar that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. The air felt electric, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Hemlock's map had outlined where the symbols on the structure were broken, their patterns interrupted by time and erosion. If we could repair them, he'd claimed, we might be able to stop whatever was bleeding through. Noah handed me a pack of chalk and a small canister of some kind of resin Hemlock insisted would hold the markings. He crouched near the base of the structure, nodding to Sarah. "Watch our backs," he said. "Yeah," she said, her voice tight. "Because I want a front row seat if something comes out of those trees." Her attempt at humor fell flat. The weight of the moment was crushing any levity. I knelt beside Noah, tracing the broken symbols with shaking hands. The carvings were deeper up close, their sharp lines glowing faintly, as if something alive was flowing beneath the stone. "Start here," Noah instructed, point to a jagged break in one of the patterns. "If we can connect this," a sound cut him off. A low, guttural growl, too deep to be human, too unnatural to be an animal. It came from the trees, circling us, like a predator stalking its prey. "Stay calm," Noah said, his voice steady. He rose to his feet, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but empty forest. Yet the growl persisted, growing louder, closer. "Just keep working," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. She held a lit flare, its bright light casting a crimson glow over the snow. I forced myself to focus, drawing the lines as carefully as I could, connecting the broken symbols with chalk. The resin Hemlock had given us filled the grooves, hardening almost instantly. With each completed pattern, the hum shifted, its tone rising and falling like a wounded animal. "It's working," Noah muttered. "Keep going." We were halfway through when the first shadow appeared. It moved between the trees, faster than I could track, a blur of darkness that seemed to ripple through the air. Sarah screamed, dropping her flare as she stumbled back. Noah fired his weapon, the crack of gunfire echoing through the forest. The shadow did not flinch. It surged forward, a shapeless mass that radiated cold. Noah barely had time to react. He threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding its path as it barreled past, disappearing into the darkness. "Jet the flares," he shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Thee hate the light." Sarah grabbed another flare from her pack, lighting it with trembling hands. The red glow pushed back the shadows, revealing more of the creatures. They moved like smoke, their edges undefined, their forms constantly shifting. But their presence was undeniable, a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest. "Hurry up," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. I worked as fast as I could, my hands fumbling with the chalk and resin. The last few symbols were the most intricate, their patterns looping and twisting in ways that defied logic. Each completed line sent a pulse of light through the structure, the carvings growing brighter with every connection. The shadows grew bolder, circling closer despite the flares. No emptied his clip into the darkness, the gunfire doing little to deter them. Sarah swung a lit flare in wide arcs, keeping the creatures at bay, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "Almost there," I muttered, my breath fogging in the freezing air. My hands were numb, the chalk slipping from my grip. As I finished the final line, the moment the last symbol was completed, the hum stopped. The forest fell silent, the sudden absence of sound more terrifying than the noise itself. The shadows froze, their forms flickering like dying flames. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought it was over. But then, the structure began to shake. The glow intensified, the carvings pulsing with a blinding light that forced us to shield our eyes. The ground beneath us trembled, cracked, spider webbing through the snow. A low, guttural roar erupted from the structure, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What did you do?" Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos.
"I don't know," I yelled back.
"It was supposed to seal it." The light surged and the shadows screamed, a high, pitched wail that sent chills down my spine. They recoiled, their forms unraveling as if being pulled apart. The structure cracked, pieces of stone crumbling away to reveal a dark void beneath. It wasn't empty. Something was moving inside, something vast and incomprehensible. "We need to go." No shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran. The forest blurred around us, the light from Sarah's flare our only guide. Behind us, the structure collapsed with a deafening roar, the ground shaking as if the earth itself was splitting open. The hum returned, louder than ever, a pulsating force that chased us through the trees. When we finally broke through the tree line, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. Noah and Sarah weren't far behind, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock. The forest was silent again, the glow from the structure extinguished. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The weight of what we'd seen hung heavy in the air, an unspoken understanding passing between us. Whatever we'd done, it wasn't over. "It's still out there," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. No didn't respond. He stared at the forest, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. As we drove back to town, the faint hum followed us, growing louder with each passing mile. The drive back to town felt like a fever dream. The faint hum accompanied us like an unwanted passenger. It wasn't loud, just enough to gnaw at the edges of my sanity, a reminder that the forest had not relinquished its hold. Sarah sat in the back, silent, her knees pulled to her chest. Noah gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road, but I could see the tension in his jaw. The town came into view, shrouded in a pale mist that clung to the ground like smoke. It was too quiet, no lights in the windows, no cars on the road. Even the usual faint glow from the power station on the hill was gone. "Something's wrong," Noah muttered. The hum grew louder. We stopped at the station first. Noah led the way, his gun drawn. As we stepped into the building, the air inside was thick, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in days. Papers were scattered across the desks, a coffee mug lay shattered on the floor, and the faint smell of ozone hung in the air. "Hello," Noah called, his voice echoing through the empty space. No response. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken fear passing between us like static. The building wasn't just empty, it felt abandoned, as though everyone had fled in a hurry, leaving only the weight of their fear behind. Noah checked the radio on his belt, his fingers trembling slightly. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Hayes, respond." A silence. He tried again. Still nothing. With a curse, he slammed the radio back onto his belt. "We need to find Hemlock." Hemlock's store was unlocked when we arrived, the door creaking open to reveal the same cluttered chaos I remembered. But it was empty too. The usual hum of activity replaced by a suffocating stillness. The faint scent of kerosene lingered in the air, and a single oil lamp flickered on the counter. "Hemlock," I called out. At first, there was no response. Then, from the back room, came the sound of shuffling footsteps. Hemlock emerged, his face pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "You shouldn't have gone back," he said, his voice hoarse. No stepped forward, his jaw tight. "We need answers, Hemlock. What's happening here?" Hemlock hesitated, his gaze darting between us. Finally, he sighed and motioned for us to sit. "It's the bindings," he said. "You disturbed them." "We were trying to fix them," I protested. "You said that was the only way to stop it." "I said it might stop it," Hemlock corrected, his voice heavy with regret. "But once you started, there was no turning back. The bindings were old, fragile. You didn't strengthen them. You broke them completely." A chill ran down my spine. "So what does that mean?" Hemlock's eyes met mine, filled with a sorrow that made my stomach turn. "It means Echo is here." The word hung in the air like a death knell. Hemlock explained, in halting, fragmented sentences, his voice cracking under the weight of his words. Echo wasn't just an entity, it was a void, an absence of light, sound, and reason. It didn't belong to our world. The bindings had been a desperate attempt by an ancient civilization to keep it contained. But time had worn them thin, and now we had unleashed it. "It doesn't take people," Hemlock said. "It erases them, wipes them clean from existence. That's why there's no trace, no footprints, no bodies. It consumes everything they were and leaves nothing behind." "How do we stop it?" Noah demanded. Hemlock shook his head. "You don't?" "There has to be a way," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "There's always a way." Hemlock hesitated, then pulled a war notebook from behind the counter. He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking, until he found what he was looking for. "There's a ritual," he said. "A final binding, but it's dangerous." "Define dangerous," Noah said flatly. Hemlock met his gaze, his expression grim. "It requires a sacrifice, a life for a life. Someone has to willingly enter the void and seal it from within." The room fell silent. We returned to the forest at dawn, the notebook clutched tightly in my hands. The hum was louder now, a constant, oppressive drone that made my teeth ache. The air was colder, the trees coated in a thin layer of frost that glistened like glass. Hemlock hadn't come with us. He'd handed me the notebook, wished me luck, and locked himself in the back room of his store. I didn't blame him. If I'd had a choice, I wouldn't have come either. Sarah walked beside me, her face pale but resolute. Noah took the lead, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as we followed the faint trail back to the ruins of the structure. The air grew heavier with every step, the hum vibrating through my chest like a second heartbeat. When we reached the clearing, the sight made my stomach churn. The structure was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. but the void remained, a swirling mass of darkness, writhing and pulsing as if alive. It didn't have a shape or form, just an overwhelming presence that seemed to suck the light from the air. Sarah gripped my arm. "Are you sure about this?"
No.
I admitted. "But we don't have a choice." The ritual was simple in theory. Draw the binding symbols around the void, recite the incantation, and offer the sacrifice. But standing there, staring into the darkness, the weight of it all hit me like a freight train. Someone had to go in, and once they did, there was no coming back. "I'll do it," Noah said suddenly. I turned to him, shocked. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his voice steady. "This started on my watch. It's my responsibility." No," Sarah said, stepping forward. "You don't have to." "Wes, I do." No interrupted. "You two have a chance to get out of this to live. I don't." He met my gaze, his expression resolute. "Just make sure it works." My throat tightened, but I nodded. "We'll make it work." We worked quickly, carving the symbols into the frozen ground with chalk and resin, just as Hemlock had instructed. The void seemed to resist, the air growing colder and heavier with each completed line. No stood at the edge, his face set in a mask of determination. When the final symbol was complete, Sarah and I stepped back, clutching the notebook tightly. No turned to us, his expression softening. "Take care of each other," he said. And then he stepped into the void. The moment he disappeared, the ground trembled and the symbols began to glow. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we'd failed. But then the light surged, blinding and pure, consuming the void in a single pulse. And then it was over. The forest was silent. The air was still. The void was gone. Noah was gone. We stumbled back to town in a daze, our minds struggling to process what had happened. The hum was gone, and the air felt lighter, almost normal. But the town wasn't the same. The streets were empty, the buildings dark. It was as if the entire place had been erased, just like the people who had vanished. Sarah and I packed what we could and left that same day. We didn't talk about what had happened. There wasn't anything left to say. Years later, I still hear the hum sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet. It creeps back into my thoughts, a faint reminder of what we lost, of what we almost unleashed. I don't know if Noah succeeded in sealing the void for good, but I like to think he did. And I like to think that wherever he is, he knows he saved us. But sometimes in the silence, I wonder what happens if it comes back.